Christ, I need a fucking haircut. Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome back to Super Kaiju Binge, Episode 4. And today I got a very special film. A film that I haven't really talked about much before. And unfortunately, I don't have an Ant-Man shirt, but I got the closest thing on, which is a Spider-Man shirt. So hopefully that's fitting. Today I will be reviewing, in my opinion, the 1954 sci-fi monster movie masterpiece, Them. Of course, being joined by Trevor Thomson. Make yourself known, boy.
Howdy, everybody. I'm back.
And we're very excited to talk about this movie. Let's jump right into the personal history. Go ahead, Trev.
Surprisingly brief, despite the fact that I really love this movie. This was one of my dad's favorites, one that he watched as a kid and that stuck with him. So he had it on TV a lot whenever I was a kid. I never got to see it in one full sitting at that time, but I got to see it in sections because, he would put it on. It would be at a certain point, and then the next time another. And there's just something about this movie that captivates. I mean, whether you're a kid, well, probably especially when you're a kid, but also still when you're an adult. And it just, even if I didn't get to see it in full until much later on, it stuck with me. And I just always remembered that 50s movie with the giant ants.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I had to seek it out and got a copy and saw it in full, and I was like, okay, I finally realized how we got from point A to point D. So that's it.
So my personal history is a little bit more involved. I have a shit ton of nostalgia for this movie. 23 years old, and I managed to see this at a very young age of like 9 or 10. But it was thanks to a certain little Animal Planet show that first exposed me to this. But before I get into that, of course, wouldn't be a true Jacksonite Studios video if I didn't have some burp fuel to go with it. And I didn't sell out, but I decided to go the Pepsi route. Because why not?
I like the three main soaps.
Okay, so when I was young, one of my favorite TV shows was Animal Planet's Most Extreme. For those of you who don't know, Animal Planet's Most Extreme was a top 10 show where it would single out animals that would have the most extreme physical attributes, like most extreme strength, speed, most aggressive types of animals, weirdest, most ingenious, smartest, just various factions of their physical attributes, and it would count down 10 videos, like one example, top 10 animals that have the biggest mouths. Number 10 was crocodile, number 9 was elephant, and so on and so forth. And there was one of them that was talking about bugs that have great strength. And of course, ants being one of them. Ants are strong enough to be able to lift 10 times their own body weight, which that may not sound like much. But if you think about a giant ant, like the size of a human, being able to lift 10 times its own body weight, that would make it quite strong. So say it weighed 200 pounds, it'd be able to lift 2,000 pounds. And I don't think ants were number 1, but I think it was around 2 or 3 that showed that they had the most extreme strength. And of course, another aspect of Most Extreme is that a lot of times they would showcase 50s monster movie footage to kind of show how scary they might be. And when they showed footage of ants, I didn't know that this was the title of the movie, but I always remembered the footage of the giant ant movie from the 50s in black and white. And I always remembered the look of the ants because they looked very realistic and very creepy. But it wasn't until a couple of years later when me and my mom and my stepdad were living in this shitty duplex for almost 10 years. No, not 10 years, like 7 or 8 years. But in the first couple of years of living there, my stepdad showed me a movie, a VHS tape of it was blue with like a desert road with a bunch of giant cartoon ants all throughout the landscape, and it was called Them. So we put it on and we sat down, and as soon as the giant ant reared its head to attack the main female scientist, I had a massive, massive mind explosion, and I realized, this is the movie from Most Extreme. Holy shit. I never thought I would actually get around to seeing this. So I was even more entranced in the movie, and I was literally just glued to the screen watching this film. And I had a massive blast watching this movie. I was like, oh my God, this movie is the greatest thing in the fucking world. It actually manages to make ants scary. Holy shit. So after that, I must have watched this movie at least a few dozen times. Although unfortunately, I actually managed to lose the VHS tape, which kind of pissed my stepdad off a little bit. But oh well, I was a kid. It wasn't until much later when I was going through a massive monster movie craze, and when I decided that, you know what, I haven't fucking seen Them in years. So, like I said in my Beast review, I decided to buy a double pack with Them, of course, and Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which I just now realized, yeah, these are both Warner Brothers movies. Even more evidence to say that Warner Brothers is my favorite film studio.
Not a bad choice.
Excuse me. No, not a bad choice at all. So anyway, of course, the first one that I watched when it finally showed up in the mail from Amazon was Them. And you know what? I was not disappointed. I was like, oh man, is this going to hold up? It did. And I was not disappointed. I must have watched it like 5 or 6 times over the course of a couple days. I was just like, oh my God, I've rediscovered a classic gem. And on my most recent viewing for Super Kaiju Binge for this film, because I was actually really excited to get around to doing this movie because I hadn't seen it in a few years. The movie still holds up. There's a couple aspects that I don't quite like about this movie, but this movie really does hold up. I think this movie very much so has stood the test of time. And I'm just going to say it. I think of all the 50s giant monster movies out there, there's quite a lot of them, and I've seen a few. Discounting the 50s Japanese monster movies and sci-fi movies, I think of the American 50s giant monster movies. Them is the number one best. Because it takes the typical atomic age monster movie formula and, in my opinion, just perfects it to its utmost, like, level 10 perfection. Trev?
Well, it was also one of the first, and it seems like, for lack of a better term, they pretty much put out their best at the start. And, I enjoy a fair amount of 50s monster movies, but this one stands out, and I think I'll save some of the reasons why I think it is, because there's a few one-offs here in terms of the genre, in terms of the people who worked on it, which might account for why it's so good. But, yeah, I really wish my story was as involved as yours was, Nick, because this movie feels like it's been in my life for such a long time, and pretty much the only thing I can say is that I just remember it being on a lot whenever I was a kid.
Well, Alrighty, so let's get into the plot, shall we? What are you doing? Oh, okay. You're not even on camera, honey. You're so paranoid. All right, let's get into the plot. Wait, Leonard Nimoy was in this movie?
Yeah, I just read that. I missed him. I'm going to have to look for him next time I watch it.
Hello. The fuck? Okay, then. Alrighty, so the movie begins in with New Mexico State Police Sergeant Ben Peterson and Trooper Ed Blackburn discovering a little girl wandering in the desert near Alamogordo. In shock and in a catatonic state, they take her to a nearby vacation trailer located by a spotter aircraft, where they find evidence that the little girl had been there when it was attacked and nearly destroyed. It is later discovered that the trailer was owned by an FBI special agent named Ellenson on vacation with his wife, son, and daughter. The other members of the girl's family remain missing. Now in an ambulance, the child briefly reacts to a pulsating, high-pitched chirping sound from the desert by sitting up in the stretcher and looking out in fear. No one else notices her reaction, and she lies back down when the noise stops. Probably one of the creepiest scenes in the whole film. At a general store owned by Gramps Johnson, another really creepy scene, Peterson and Blackburn find him dead and a wall of the store partially torn out, just like in the trailer. With a quick look around, Peterson leaves Blackburn behind to secure the crime scene. However, when this same high-pitched chirping sound starts up again, Blackburn goes outside to investigate. Gunshots are fired, the sound grows faster and louder, and Blackburn emits a scream and also goes missing. Peterson's chief later points out that both Johnson and Blackburn had fired their weapons at their attacker, and more puzzling is the coroner's report on Johnson's brutal death. His back was broken in 5 places, his neck was snapped, his rib cage was crushed, and here's one for Sherlock Holmes. There's enough formic acid in him to kill 20 men. Which I don't know exactly what effect formic acid has on living tissue, but yeah, it's probably safe to assume he OD'd massively on formic acid.
I figure whenever you get bitten by an ant, that's what causes the swelling.
The FBI sends Special Agent Robert Graham, played by James Arness, as Trev pointed out to me, a.k.a. the guy who played the original Thing from 1951, to New Mexico to investigate, and after a strange footprint is found near the Ellison's trailer, the Department of Agriculture sends myrmecologist Dr. Harold Medford, played by Edmund Gwen, and his daughter, Dr. Pat Medford, to assist in the investigation. The elder Medford exposes the Ellison girl to formic acid fumes, which rips her from her catatonic state into a state of panic, her screaming, "Them!" Title drop. Medford's suspicions of Campanotus vicinus, I think that's how you pronounce it, I'm not very good at Latin, are validated by her reaction, but he will not reveal his theory prematurely. At the Ellison campsite, Pat discovers a giant 8-foot-long foraging ant. And following instructions from the elder Medford, Peterson and Graham shoot off the ant's antennae, blinding it, and they kill it using a Thomson submachine gun. Medford reveals his theory: a colony of giant ants mutated by radiation from the first atomic bomb test near Alamogordo is responsible for all these deaths. General O'Brien orders an Army helicopter search, and the ant's nest is soon found. Cyanide gas bombs are tossed inside, and Graham, Peterson, and Pat descend into the nest to check for survivors. And inside, they find evidence that 2 queen ants have hatched and escaped to establish new colonies. Peterson, Graham, and the Medfords join a government task force which covertly begins to investigate reports of unusual activity. In one, a civilian pilot has been committed to a mental hospital after claiming that he was forced down by UFOs shaped like giant ants. Next, the Coast Guard receives a report of a giant queen hatching her brood in the hold of a freighter at sea in the Pacific. Giant ants attack the ship's crew, and there are few survivors. The freighter is later sunk by U.S. Navy gunfire. A third report about a large sugar theft, 40 tons worth, at a rail yard leads Peterson, Graham, and Major Kibbe to Los Angeles. An alcoholic in a hospital drunk tank claims he has seen giant ants outside his window. The mutilated body of a father is discovered, but his 2 young sons are still missing. Peterson, Graham, and Kibbe find evidence that they were flying a model airplane in the Los Angeles River drainage channel under the hospital. Martial law is declared in LA, and troops are assigned to find the ant nest in the vast storm drain system under the city. Peterson finds the 2 missing boys alive, trapped by the ants near the nest. He calls for reinforcements and lifts both boys to safety just before being grabbed and attacked by an ant in its mandibles. Graham arrives with reinforcements and kills the ant, but Peterson dies from his injuries as others swarm to protect the nearby nest. Graham and the soldiers fight off the ants, but a tunnel collapses, trapping Graham. Several ants charge away, but he is able to hold them off with his Tommy gun just long enough for troops to break through. The queen and her hatchlings are discovered quickly and destroyed with flamethrowers. Dr. Medford offers a philosophic observation. When man entered the atomic age, he opened the door to a new world. What we may eventually find in that new world, nobody can predict. Which honestly really does remind me of the ending of the original Gojira. Not quite as pessimistic as the ending to Gojira, but it is very similar in my opinion.
There's a sense of wonder to this delivery, and there's a sense of trauma for the one at the end of Gojira, which is just kind of a difference between the 2 cultures and how we approach nuclear power.
Yeah, true. So how about this plot, Trev?
Pretty damn good. I would also like to point out that I've been in Alamogordo once on vacation several years ago. We visited White Sands. It's pretty smart out there. And if there were giant ants running around and there was nobody around to help you out, it would be a bad situation.
No doubt. So, in my opinion, this movie's plot, it couldn't have been done any other way. This is a very well executed, very well thought out, very, very good science fiction atomic monster movie plot. It's the reveal, or no, it's the ensuing incident, the investigation, the build-up, the big reveal, even more investigation, attacks, counterattacks, killing the monster. That's the formula to monster movies, and in this movie, it perfects it. It couldn't have been done any other way, and it's very interesting. It's very intriguing. It's kind of scary. It's entertaining. It's just a fucking well thought out, well made monster movie plot. And I don't have enough good to say. Well, I do, but I have so much good things to say about this film. So, Trev, why don't you get into your pros?
And real quick, everything is done to the highest standard.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so pro number 1 is the effects. They are used minimally, but out of all the animatronic or rubber monsters that you saw pop up from this era, these are by far the best executed because they look like actual ants. They have good mobility and articulation to them. And again, the fact that they're used sparsely, I mean, even if they did linger on them, it's a very well executed design. And and the size of them and everything. Whenever they first realize that they're dealing with giant ants, whenever Pat Medford gets attacked by one, that scene kind of reminds me, and I don't know if they were referring back to it or not. It reminds me of whenever they find that they analyze the dead graboid in the first Tremors a little bit. I mean, not like shot for shot, but I think there was a bit of an influence in terms of them realizing what they were dealing with at the present time. And also the fact that they realized, hey, there isn't just one of these running around, which, you know, it wouldn't make sense for there to just be one giant ant running around because, you know, these things live in colonies. So
maybe there is a superficial similarity between this and Tremors. I can see where you're coming from. Honestly, this movie's plot, just to really quick give a more modern comparison, this movie's plot really reminds me of Aliens.
Yeah, I was going to get into that later.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, it's actually one of my last pros. That's how it worked out whenever I listed them. But no, maybe it's also the fact that both Tremors and them take place in a desert, and they're both bug monsters to a degree. It might just be one of those subliminal things that you don't really realize until you think about it. But yeah, the effects, I mean, probably not spectacular, but I do think they are very well executed in this movie. So moving right along to pro number 2. It's used minimally again, but I do think the music in this movie is very effective, particularly in the first act whenever the mystery is being built up. It is quite creepy. It's not on the level of something like Ennio Morricone's score for The Thing, but it actually still does have a bit of a foreign flavor to it. The composer for this movie was Bronislaw Kaper. I'm not sure how to pronounce the last name. But this was the only sci-fi or horror movie that he did in his career. So I think that it actually helps that this was, I think, one of the only times he broke from his genre. I think he did maybe some Westerns and some other things. I need to look over his credits again, but this was the only thing that was in the sci-fi genre. But yeah, I did think, again, it's used minimally, but particularly in that first act, I think the music has a good atmosphere to it. Okay, and pro number 3, there's actually a pretty good sense of humor in this movie. Nothing like really over the top or anything, but nice little bits of dialogue that make you chuckle. I think of, in particular, whenever they're searching out the nest, and Professor Dr. Medford, Harold Medford, he doesn't know how to properly communicate on a radio, and Ben Peterson, our cop, is trying to get him to do the right lingo, and finally at the end of it, that little exchange of
dialogue. Oh, now you're happy.
Oh, now you're happy. And does a raspberry. That always makes me laugh. And the other thing, something that's actually stuck with me ever since I was a kid, is whenever they're talking to the drunk later on, whenever they're in Los Angeles, and the guy says, "Make me a sergeant in charge of the booze." It's a pretty catchy little tune he does, and it's always made me laugh.
That's probably the only cringy moment in this movie, because it's just so fucking stupid.
Yeah, well, that's probably why it sticks out, is because it's dumb. But you know, it's for movies from this era. Usually, unfortunately, there's a lot of times where you laugh unintentionally. But I think that these were some examples of genuine humor, and everything else surrounding the movie was effectively done so that you didn't have to laugh at it unintentionally. But moving right along, pro number 4, there is a really, really palpable sense of doom to this movie. I think that if John Carpenter had remade this movie, it would have been a contender for his little Apocalypse trilogy, or if he had made all the movies that are part of that trilogy and then like a remake of this, then it would be his Apocalypse series, because just it's the situation they're dealing with is if they don't take care of it really soon, I mean, it's apocalyptic. There's no coming back from it, most likely. And so that kind of factors into pro number 5, which is the suspense.
Oh, yeah.
Particularly in the first act, and Nick's already kind of got into. There's also a very good creep factor to this movie that, again, you don't really see very often, or it doesn't hold up with movies from the 1950s. But this, it definitely is very involving. You're on the edge of your seat during that first act, especially if you're one of those fortunate few who happen to know that this isn't a movie about giant ants, which is really hard because, like, if you get a DVD, you know, they're on the cover.
Yeah, like if you get this copy of my DVD here, the freaking poster is on the front of the disc itself that has giant ants with reptile eyes. It just totally gives it away right then and there.
Yeah, so really, unless you happen to be lucky and like catch this on TV and you don't like read the info or anything and you just start watching it, I do think that it's a very good sense of mystery that they build up and a great creep factor. The fact that they find a little girl wandering the desert and she's completely lacking any response to anything, any attempts at communicating with her. And the sound that the ants make, if I heard that in the middle of nowhere, I'd probably crap my pants.
Yep.
And the nighttime scene where they're at the store and they're checking things out, that's very creepy. It's just all very effective creep factor that sticks with you. And the suspense is pretty good. And even whenever we realize what we're dealing with, there's still, you know, whenever they're, you know, in Washington and they're trying to keep this from the public, it's just, again, that sense of doom and the suspense of what you're just waiting to see how long is it going to be before the public actually knows about it, or, you know, how are they going to present it? And you just realize the stakes as they apply the science of ants to these giant versions, and then you realize,
damn,
man,
this is a big problem.
Yeah, it's a big problem. These are pretty much the replacements for the dominant species on the planet, which I think maybe this wasn't like a direct reference to them. That also kind of comes back up in like Godzilla 98. Basically, this whole idea of radioactive mutants creating these new species that could very easily be the new dominant ones.
Well, I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I could be wrong. I mean, God forbid if something like this actually does come true, but I don't think it would take a year for giant ants to completely consume the world, but it would be a catastrophic problem if that was to actually occur. But I think
you raise a good point.
That might have just been like he was saying a year just to really show, just to kind of like spook everybody into saying, hey, take this seriously. This is a problem.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a scare factor, and that kind of just works for the audience as well. An escalation of the stakes, pretty much.
Which also kind of reminds me of...
And then moving on.
Well, hang on real quick. It also does kind of remind me of the scene where Blair finds out that the thing would take over the world in 27,000 hours.
Yeah, exactly. There's, you know, even if like these later directors don't exactly remember where they got the influence from, I think this movie has a lot of influence on later flicks in the genre, not just in the 50s, but later on down the road.
Yeah, continue.
But pro number six is that this movie relies on imagination a lot, which, you know, for some people that could be a problem, but it's one of the most effective examples of where what you're told and what you imagine from the situation is probably better than what they could show. Now that's, you know, not everybody shares that sentiment, but in very few movies actually do effectively rely on imagination. Usually you just realize that they're kind of trying to make sure that they don't spend their budget, and they want to show their effects minimally because it's more cost effective. But for the time, what they let us imagine is pretty good. Again, it factors into that sense of suspense and the sense of doom. Is that, or like some shots that they couldn't pull off, like whenever the Texas pilot he sees the Queen and her escorts. That would have been something neat to have seen. But again, it's just all these little tidbits that you're imagining in your head. And I think this is probably a good place to bring up the direction, which was done by a fella named Gordon Douglas. This was another one-off for him. He didn't do any other sci-fi or monster movies, and it actually makes me wonder if he had done more, what other good examples could there be in the genre if he had, been behind the camera? Because, maybe it's the writing. Well, I wouldn't even say that, because George Worthington Yates was one of the writers for this, and he also did a few other movies in the genre. It Came from Beneath the Sea, Earth versus the Flying Saucers, and another example I don't remember right now. But I don't really necessarily think it was entirely the script, but the person who actually executed it that made a difference. And I think that it would have been neat if Gordon Douglas had been directing some other movies at the time. We might have had even more iconic classics that still hold up to this day.
Well, like imagine if he ever did a giant spider movie and not like tarantula size, but just like spiders the size of a human type film, just like this movie. Or if he was to do a giant centipede movie in the spirit of this movie, would have been kind of interesting.
Centipede would be really cool, because you really don't see them be the stars of any movies of this type. They're usually part of an ensemble.
Which is a shame, because fucking giant centipedes would fucking suck.
And they could do it today, but it, maybe it would depend on who you got to do it for it to have a really good sense of charm to it. But yeah, anyway, I think that the imagination behind this movie, in terms of what it lets you picture in your head, and the fact that its direction is, for genre, one of a kind, I definitely think that works in this movie's favor. All right, so the next three pros, 7, 8, and 9, I could have really just put these under the banner of cast, but these were the characters that stood out to me. For number one of those, and this is pro number 7, is Ben Peterson, who is that is kind of our lead for the first act of the movie, and then it's a kind of a sharing of responsibilities with him and Robert Graham, James Arness. But Peterson is definitely the more likable of the two.
Yes.
And there's just some kind of quality to him where you feel that he's a good cop, and that he's gonna do his job until he finds the results that he needs to. Mm-hmm. And there's something about the actor James Whitmore. He kind of reminds me of Spencer Tracy a little bit, but he has hairier brows than Spencer. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I don't know what else much to say aside from the fact that Peterson is a pretty good lead, and I won't say that he's relatable, because I'm not a cop, but in terms of his execution as a human being, in terms of the type of person that he is, I feel that's relatable. And that's why, spoiler alert, whenever he dies, that it is actually quite sad. There's some people that die in these old monster movies in general, really, that you couldn't care less about. But whenever he goes, it's like, oh man. And he was doing such a good job too. It's a noble sacrifice in a way. Whenever he's rescuing the two boys later on.
I'll say my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, and then pro 8 and 9 are the Metfords, Pat and Harold. Pat, we got into this for our Beast review. You said that you liked Lee. I actually like Pat even more in this regard, because
me too.
Yeah, there's there's examples also from the 50s where they kind of actually make fun of the scientist, the woman scientist, or the assertive female. And it's always kind of condescending sometimes how they execute it in these movies. But in this case, Pat really does stand her ground.
Mm-hmm.
And, she's kind of belittled a little bit by Graham early on. And not like super bad, but it's just that.
Well, Graham really stuck out to me. Like his banter with her, this really stuck out to me on this most recent rewatching. He's a little bit of a dick.
It's basically that whole "I man, you woman" kind of thing, and you have your place.
Yeah, and he gets put in his place. But continue.
Yeah, that's exactly why I like Pat, is the fact that she doesn't make a big stink about it, because what delegitimizes people sometimes is the fact that they get all whiny and they let the criticism get to them in the worst ways. But all Pat does is that she continually she just shows that she is one of the experts on this, and eventually the respect that she deserves, is recognized simply by how she performs on the job. And like she's the one who, whenever they're down in the catacombs of the first nest, she's the one who says, "Just burn everything. We're not going to keep this for scientific value.
Nope.
We're just going to burn it because that's what we need to do."
Yep.
And it's actually a good thing that she went down there despite Graham's protests, because she's the one who made that decision.
Yep.
And then her dad, Harold, played
by
Edmund Gwynn, who is also Santa Claus from the original Miracle on 34th Street.
What?
Yep. Did I blow your mind again?
Damn! The fuck?
Well, he doesn't have a in this movie. That's probably why. He also wears glasses a lot, so that probably makes it less obvious at first. But yeah, that's him.
I had no idea.
Yes, sir. Santa Claus is in this flick. So Dr. Medford, he's
love him.
There's a lot. What was that?
I love Dr. Arness in this movie. He's the greatest of all 50s scientists.
Yeah, I would actually agree. He obviously knows what he's talking about. He's kind of funny. I mean, he adds into that the humor that I mentioned earlier. He also, just the way he delivers some dialogue, like after they make the first discovery of whenever the ant attacks Pat, and then they're talking, and all of a sudden they hear them chirping off in the distance, and he has this really haunting, really chilling line where he says, "We may be witnesses to a biblical prophecy," and he goes on from there. But that's just one of those moments.
Mm-hmm.
It just always sticks out because there's a genuine creep factor to it. People will sometimes dismiss monster movies as like, oh, they're so implausible, and so, something that you shouldn't take seriously. But this is one of the movies that is executed so well that it just really makes you think about the potential of something like this really went down. And his line is one of those many factors that contributes to it. So yeah, I'm sure you're probably going to get into it more, but he's definitely obviously a highlight.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And last pro number 10. This movie has quite a bit of influence on later things. I mean, not even just in that regard. It's the fact that this movie does hold up. It's a very prime example of the genre at the top of its game. And usually in that case, those always tend to be the ones that are very influential later on. Nick already brought it up, and he'll probably go into it in his own way. But it's very clear that James Cameron, there's two movies that I think played an influence on James Cameron's Aliens.
Shawnee Boy's here.
One, especially because of the Queen and the way, basically the xenomorphs were turned into space ants. And also, Newt is an extended callback to the girl in this movie.
Mm.
Definitely more fleshed out in Aliens, but still you can tell if you're familiar with the genre, you can definitely trace it back to this movie. And also, just for the sake of, because I don't think we're probably going to ever review Forbidden Planet, but there's one scene in that where the crew are about to be attacked by the or the id monster in that flick, and when you watch it, you realize, oh, this is like the scene in Aliens whenever they're all holed up and the xenomorphs cut the power and they're slowly getting closer and closer, crawling up in the ceiling. If you watch that scene from Aliens and you watch the scene from Forbidden Planet where their invisible barrier is about to be breached, it's very similar. So yeah, definitely an influence there. And there's a list of influences on Wikipedia. Apparently, a band made a reference back to this movie. It's popped up in a bunch of, well, at least one sitcom. It popped up on a Friends episode. It's popped up in movies in recent years. Ant-Man and the Wasp was one recently.
Yeah, thank God.
Yeah. I don't know what else to say aside from the fact that this is probably one of the most influential movies of the time or the genre.
And also, for you video game fans out there, in Fallout 3, which takes place in a post-apocalyptic irradiated wasteland, there's a side quest involving giant mutated fire ants titled Those, which is an homage to this movie. So even there.
Oh, that's right. I just found out about that. A friend of mine was playing it.
Anything else to say before I get into my pros?
No, sir. I think you can just take it away.
Alrighty, so pro one is that the characters in this movie are very, very, very good. I'm just going to talk about the main four, which is Ben, James Arness, Pat, and her dad. The four main characters in this movie are very, very, very good. We'll talk about Ben because he's kind of the lead and in my opinion is the best character in the whole film. I love this guy. He's very proactive. He's very intelligent. He's very quick to think on his feet, and he's very believable in the role. He's not just a typical. He's not just a typical no nonsense, like I just want to destroy everything and ask no questions type of guy. He's actually willing to sit down and listen to some science and listen to some facts and actually make a plan before he goes out and tries to destroy the monsters. Although when he decides to go out and destroy the monsters, he does it very, very well. And I say he's quick to think on his feet because when the first ant shows up, he's the first one to run back to his car and grab the Tommy gun because, it's a giant ant. Just having your little revolvers isn't really going to do shit to kill it. So he goes and grabs the Tommy gun. He just starts spraying and praying, and he takes down the ant. And when they start chirping again, he cocks the Tommy gun, and he's ready to go once again. And he's also the one to go down and start unleashing the flamethrower in the nest. So this guy's a total badass. He's very intelligent. He knows how to think on his feet. He's very believable in the role. And one thing that really stuck out to me is his big concern over the little girl at the beginning of the film, because one of the first things he says about her is that I want to be there when she comes out of shock, or when she becomes more coherent. And when she's prevalent in the movie's story, he's always there by her side, front and center, which I kind of think that the actor must have been a father, and he was kind of channeling that into his performance. So that's really cool to see.
That's definitely a likability factor.
Yeah, very much so. James Arness, he's also very likable. Not quite as much as Ben because he's a likable guy, and he's quick to bring out the guns, and he's quick to really try to be active in destroying the monsters. But the big thing that kind of brings him down a little bit is his I'm man, you woman type attitude towards Pat. Ben doesn't give a shit. He's right there with saying, "Hey, she should come along with us." But James Arness's character is the typical 50s "I'm man, you woman" type character, and it's not super pronounced because, like Trev said, he does get put in his place a little bit, or not a little bit. Yeah, he does get put in his place. But whenever he kind of starts throwing a hissy fit of saying the woman stays behind, uh, in my case, it's just like, you know what, dude? She's more experienced in this shit than you are. Why the fuck are you throwing a fit and just not allowing the one person who is physically fit and also knows what the fuck she's doing to tag along with your assignment? Grow a dick and don't be an asshole, dude. But he gets over that, and in the third act of the movie, he gets his shit together and he starts being as proactive as Ben, and he also manages to survive, and he proves that he's a worthy fighter when he keeps fighting off, I think, like 3 or 4 ants when he gets trapped for a moment near the nest. I thought that was a really cool and intense scene. Now we're talking about Pat. Now, like how I said that Lee is the kind of an atypical female scientist character in a 50s monster movie, Pat is even more so. And I praise that in Beast and 20,000 Fathoms, there's some hinted sexual tension between her and the main character of that movie, but it's not overly pronounced. Here, it's even less pronounced. There's a little bit of flirtatious stuff between her and James Arness in the third act of the movie, but it's really not very pronounced. I just think that's them having really good chemistry with each other, and they're working well together to solve a problem. And by the end of it, there's no suggested romantic stuff. There's no suggested sexual tension. It's just they're working on a big assignment and they just grew to like each other. This is a friendship type stuff. This is not really romantic, in my opinion. And they really don't try to shove that down your throat to make this more PC or what's the word? Mainstream for the time.
Yeah. Flirting is not the definition of a relationship, or doesn't mean that there's a relationship.
Exactly. There's a little bit of flirting in this movie, but they don't go anywhere else past that. Another aspect about her is that she's very proactive as well. Aside from her dad, she may as well be the head of the Department of Agriculture because she knows her shit. Her theories are all proven to be true, and she's very intelligent in figuring out what the hell's going on alongside her dad. So I really like that about her. She's not a whiny damsel in distress, which is, if she was, well, she's a little bit of a whiny damsel in distress only when the first ant pops its head out and spooks her. But that's understandable because that would have been anybody's reaction to seeing a giant 8-foot-long ant looming above you, opening its mouth. Other than that, she's not a damsel in distress. She's a very proactive member of the cast, and she's just a great character. And then there's her dad, played by Santa Claus from Miracle on 34th Street. Motherfuck. I love him. He's the greatest of all 50s B-movie scientists. Granted, the guy in Beast wasn't that bad, but this guy takes that and just perfects it. He knows exactly what the hell is going on, and he knows how to add his knowledge and his experience into this situation. And one thing that stuck out to me, he kind of dumbs down the scientists for the military people. Like after the ant is discovered, and he starts explaining giant ant stuff to the general and military, he pulls down a diagram of a typical ant's nest. And he says, this isn't exactly what it's going to look like, but it'll give you an idea of what you're going up against when we find the nest. He tries to make this more understandable for the dumb military personnel. so that he puts it in simple terms so that they can understand the severity of the situation and so that they can figure out a solution to solve the problem. He's not that typical scientist who only speaks in scientific technobabble and leaves everybody else in the dust. He tries to dumb things down in order to get people to truly understand what's going on. I love that about his character. Another thing that surprises me is that usually with 50s B movie scientists, they're not really proactive in the third act of trying to kill the monster, but he's still prevalent in the plot until the very end of the movie. He's the one who investigates the final nest to see if the queens have taken off. He discovers no, they have not. They're fresh, so we still have time. Burn them to the ground. He never just kind of gets casted to the side in the third act like so many other, or killed off like in Beast in 20,000 Fathoms. He stays prevalent throughout the entire movie whenever he's introduced. So I love that about him. Every character in this, well, the main 4 characters in this movie are great. The rest of the cast is good, but they're just typical 50s giant monster movie cast. Not bad per se, but nothing really to write home about. Though there was one little line of dialogue that involved General O'Brien, which I don't know if that was a reference to Willis O'Brien or not. But when they discovered the nest and they started firing bazooka shells at the nest in order to make it hotter, Ben says, "I never thought I'd be giving orders to a general in my lifetime," which I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, I want to bring something up about O'Brien, and this is just a neat little bit of trivia. Seeing I'm a real big fan of House of Dracula, believe it or not. The actor, Onslow Stevens,
really
plays Dr. Edelman in that movie.
You like House of Dracula?
I do.
What? Who does he play?
He plays Dr. Edelman in that movie.
Oh. I recognize the voice, yeah.
Yeah, it was the voice that really stuck out to me. I was like, oh, okay, this is the same guy.
Oh, man, why do you like House of Dracula? That movie sucks.
Well, do you want me to save it for whenever we do a Universal series?
Well, no, just tell me real quick, because that's not going to be for a long time.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so real quick, House of Dracula feels a lot more focused than House of Frankenstein. House of Frankenstein has some good continuity with Meets the Wolfman, but it feels like not everything comes together in a good cohesive whole in House of Frankenstein. House of Dracula, minus the bit where they bring the monster back at the very end, is pretty much just focused on Wolfman and Dracula at a rehab center, pretty much.
Oh, yeah, like Sean says, House of Dracula is dull. I agree. All right, so.
Well, raspberry on y'all. No, I'm just kidding.
Alrighty, so pro number 2 is the suspense. Holy crap.
Sure.
The first act of this movie has some of the best suspense of any monster movie that I've ever seen. It's all about the buildup. And it's all about the mystery and the creepy intrigue of this movie. You don't really see all that much, but it's what you hear. It's what you hear, and you see the aftermath of the ants tearing apart the trailer, and especially the store, because the place is just totally trashed. And the buildup of seeing the ant for the first time. It's great. It's honestly, it kind of sends shivers up my spine a little bit.
Exactly.
And even in the second act too, when the ants are a little bit more prevalent on screen, the suspense is still there. Especially when they go into the nest, like you see all these dead ant carcasses, and you're wondering, are any of these going to spring back to life? And they don't, but they do come across a little pocket of ants that still survived. And when they break out, it's kind of a good jump scare moment. But yeah, the suspense in this movie is top notch. What? Don't be a hater. Pro number 3. I'm gonna group pro number 3 and 4 into their own. But pro number 3 is the science, and pro number 4 is the realism. They really try to go out of their way to make this movie as plausible as possible. Granted, yeah, it's giant ants the size of a car. Not quite as plausible as you may think, but they really try to go out of their way to make this seem as plausible as possible. And you think, okay, so this could actually be how something like this would happen. And the realism goes in. Giant ants would be a massive problem, and these, I'm guessing, these are just typical ants you would find in your backyard. Like no special kind of species of ant. Like these aren't giant fire ants, or these aren't giant bulldog ants or giant bullet ants. They're just like giant carpenter ants. No pun intended. But still, giant ants in their most basic form, that's still a problem. Because they'll tear your ass to pieces. But yeah, the realism and the science are, I find, to be very, very, very plausible in this movie. They really go out of their way to make it as real as possible, to make it as convincing as possible. And like I said earlier in this movie, they do manage to make ants scary. I'll get to that in a little bit. Pro number 6 is, let's get into it, the scares. Yeah, this movie's, no, pro number 5, excuse me. Pro number 5 is the scares. Yeah, this movie can be scary. Now, there's no other giant 50s monster movie out there that actually legitimately scared me. I never found any giant monster movie to be from this time to be really scary at all. But this one definitely is kind of scary. It goes back to the suspense, and especially the very first reveal of the first giant ant in this movie. It's very well done because it's not just a quick jump cut to a giant ant right in your face. It's a static shot of Pat like below a little hill, and you start hearing that sound, which I'll admit that sound gets a little annoying later in the movie, but in the first act, it's creepy. But you hear that sound going off, and they're all looking around, like, where the hell is that coming from? And then you don't really see it at first because it's obscured by some bushes, but then you see the ant slowly rise up from above. Okay, yeah, that's one scene in Creature from the Black Lagoon is kind of creepy. But you see the ant slowly rise up from behind the bushes, and it's not real. It's making the sound, but it doesn't really notice Pat. But then when it does notice Pat, the sound gets louder and more intense. Then Pat turns around, she screams, and the ant starts to attack. That scene, I'll admit, my jaw dropped. Because I didn't see the ant at first, but then when I saw, I was like, holy shit. And then when it started chirping louder, it actually did kind of make me jump a little bit. So I'll give this movie credit. This movie did manage to kind of scare me when I was a kid. It made me a little wary of ants for a while after I saw this.
Do you know how they did the sounds?
No, I do not.
They used bird voice tree frogs mixed in with the calls of a wood thrush, hooded warbler, and a red-bellied woodpecker.
Huh.
That's interesting.
Yeah, the sound is very distinctive too. I don't know if ants make noises, but certainly would be fair to assume that if they were this size, they would make some kind of sound. But the sound's very distinctive. Like I said, it gets a little annoying later in the film because it's like the soundtrack is nothing but that noise, as my wife pointed out when I was watching the film. But yeah, it is very distinctive, and it is kind of creepy, especially when you first hear it in the movie. They hear that sound, and the little girl raises her head up, and she has that look of shock on her face. It is a little... Do you need to take a shit?
No, what the hell?
The look on her face and listening to that sound, it is kind of creepy. And that's the biggest thing that you can take away from this movie, especially in the first act. This movie is creepy as fuck. Yeah, so pro number 6 is the music in this movie it's decent. I don't think it's quite as good as Trevor makes it out to be, but I do think the music for this movie is quite decent. In my opinion, it's typical giant monster movie music, but at least it is giant monster movie music. It fits what's going on screen. It's exciting when things are exciting. And one thing that I noticed about this is the sound design is really, really good. I think the best moment of sound is because there are some moments where there's no music at all. You just hear the sounds of the world. But I think the best is after Ben leaves and Ed stays behind at the store. After he leaves, he goes to shut off the radio, and that's when the chirping sound starts up. All you hear is the chirping and the sounds of the wind, and there's nothing else. And Ed is just standing there with his gun out, and he shuts off all the lights, and all you hear is the wind and the chirping sound. It's really, really creepy. But overall, the music is all right. It's not great, but it's not bad either. It's 50s giant monster movie music, but it works to its advantage. And that's the best thing I can say about it. So let's see. 1, 2, 3.
Should be 7 now.
No, it's actually 8. Hang on. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, yeah, it's 7. Okay. Pro number 7 is the action scenes in this movie are pretty damn entertaining. When Ben, Pat, and James I don't even remember the guy's name. James Arness go into the ant nest. It's kind of quick, but I would call that an action scene where they're gunning down and literally blowing down a couple of ants. It's a fun scene. And then the third act is when the movie becomes a lot more action-packed. The ant attack on the ship is pretty entertaining. It's pretty short, but it's still entertaining. But especially in the third act when they're just doing an all-out assault on the ant nest is very exciting and it's very entertaining, especially when James Arness is fighting off 4 ants all by himself with just a Tommy gun. It's really intense and it's just really entertaining. The action scenes in this movie are really, really well done. Excuse me. And of course, the final shootout when the whole military is just unleashing everything into the ant nest under the city. It's great spectacle to watch. So yeah, not much to say about that. It's just that the action scenes are very, very entertaining. Pro number 8. Hang on a second. 1, 2. Yeah, pro number 8 is the ants themselves. I'm not going to talk about the effects quite yet, but the ants themselves, I love them. They're creepy, and they're scary. They are very believable in their appearance. I mean, you take one look at it, yep, that's a giant ant. And I would actually say they're some of the most underrated giant monsters in all existence because of how well they're executed and how well the effects are pulled off too. But like you buy these guys as an actual big gigantic threat in this movie. Also helps what? Also really helps. I'll just talk about the effects. Fuck it, I'm just not gonna hold up. I think the special effects are fantastic. The giant ants were portrayed by, I believe, puppets or maybe like primitive animatronics, but they're totally believable in my opinion. They don't show that much of them. They never, like, I don't think you ever see an ant in its full form, except for maybe one shot. Like, it's like a distant shot where the ant first attacks Pat, and you see it from kind of like Ben and her dad's perspective. You see the ant crawl down the hill and start to walk towards Pat, but you don't really see it quite in full because part of it's blocked off by a little mound, and also there's a whole bunch of sand blowing about, so you don't see it clearly. But you do see their heads and a majority of their body quite a bit throughout this film. What I love about the designs of these ants is their eyes. Their eyes are so creepy. Now, ants have compound eyes just like every other insect, but what makes them really creepy is that they kind of seem like they have giant pupils in the middle. That's not what they are. At least I don't think that's what they are, but it looks like they just have big, giant cartoon eyes on them. And I actually think that makes them look even more unsettling. And the way their mandibles move, it's very believable. And I actually, no, now that I think about it, I think the closest that you do see to their full body is when James Arness and Ben are in hazmat suits and they're at the opening of the ant nest. There's one scout that's just seemingly trying to just escape all the heat. I feel like that's the closest that you get to seeing an ant in its full form, but it's quickly engulfed in flame. Now, I don't know how many props they had to showcase multiple ants in this movie. I think at the very least there was 4, and at the very most there was maybe 6. Kind of like Aliens. They had 6 different xenomorph suits for that film. But the ants themselves and the special effects are fucking phenomenal in my opinion. Very well showcased, very well designed, very well executed, very creepy, very unnerving, very scary, and very unsettling. Yeah, they're great. Love them. So with all these good things to say about this movie, Trev, you got any cons?
Nothing that really brings down the film for me. I did think that Grams, that's the agent guy, James Arness.
Yeah.
I think his attitude was a bit of a problem, but it goes away fairly quick.
Mm-hmm.
You brought up something that I can kind of see, but I'll just let you get into it. So no, I don't really have any strong cons for it.
I have 2. Now, I love the third act of this movie just the same, but I do kind of think the third act loses a little bit of steam in that it kind of just devolves back into the typical giant monster movie formula of, okay, now we know what the monster is. It's time to attack it and kill it. Kind of like the Beast of 20,000 Fathoms or like a little bit of King Kong syndrome there. Like it's time to attack the monster and kill it. And it just kind of seems like they rush to have the movie end on a big bang. Now, it does end on a big bang in a good way. And it's not like Beast of 20,000 Fathoms where the ending just kind of ends on a big bang, but it's still anticlimactic. The movie is resolved in a logical and conclusive way, and it doesn't feel completely rushed, but it feels a tad bit rushed in the third act. But it is still well executed and entertaining. But con number 2, and this is my biggest problem with this movie, man, why did Ben have to die? He's the most likable character in this entire film. But why does he have to die?
Well, that's why they do it, the sympathy. If you didn't like him, you wouldn't care.
I still feel like that was just a big spit in the face. Like, why would you kill off the most likable character in the whole movie? The fuck?
Well, yeah, especially seeing how, as opposed to Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, they actually keep around the scientist character for the better. They probably could have just had everybody live. But then again, I think it's a noble sacrifice deal.
True, and I do think that's probably the best way that you can justify it, quote unquote, because he saves the 2 kids. But still, I feel like it was a little too mean-spirited and stupid how he was just randomly killed off at the very end. But with all that being said, Trev, your final thoughts?
Oh, also, one quick little thing about the pacing of the other acts after the first. I think once you realize what you're dealing with, the suspense probably isn't as strong, and that probably accounts for why it goes a bit quicker there towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
But, all right, so my final thoughts. I mean, I think in some way, I've kind of pointed this out already, I think this is probably the pinnacle of the genre at the time, at least for American-made movies. Very memorable. I mean, once you watch the whole, I mean, as Nick elaborated, there were different parts of it that stuck out to him before he actually realized what movie he was watching. But still, I mean, yeah, this is the pinnacle. Mm-hmm. And I would also like to point out, along the notes of movies that give me the creeps from the 50s, this one does it, but also, surprisingly, The Giant Behemoth does too. I think there's some good atmosphere at the start of that as well. Yeah, if you're a monster movie fan, this is definitely something you should seek out. I think maybe this is too high of praise, but we gushed about The Thing some reviews ago. But I think for what that was for the 80s, them is for the 50s.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, my final thoughts on them. Guys, I love the crap out of this movie. This is one of my favorite monster movies of all time. And this in general is one of my... Ooh, hello. And this in general is one of my favorite films of all time. I love this movie to death. I absolutely intend on showing this to my kids when they become of age. I want them to be giant monster movie fans, and I definitely want them to at least see this movie once.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I'm not watching.
I love the shit out of this movie. So my final rating is a 9.5 out of 10. I wanted to give it a perfect 10, but the fact that Ben dies is just a slight bit of a deal breaker for me. It takes just that little tiny edge of this movie away from me, but I can't recommend this movie enough. If you are a giant fan of 50s monster movies, I definitely agree with Trev. This is the best of the bunch. It's a little sad that in the early part of the 50s, the 50s monster movie genre reached its peak, not counting Japan stuff, because there's another movie that came out, well, two other movies that came out in 1954, but I think for typical giant atomic age monster movies, this is the best of the bunch. It's a little sad that it reached its peak so early in the 50s, but whatever. Not to say that there weren't later giant atomic age monster movies that were bad, and some that even came close, like The Giant Behemoth, but it's not quite as good, and them is definitely the best of the bunch. So I highly recommend this movie to anyone who's a giant monster movie fan. Go out and buy it. It's dirt cheap. It's pretty accessible to watch. And it's not very long either, and it's surprisingly long for a 50s movie. It's only 97 minutes long, which kind of surprised me. So it's a perfect package. Check it out. Trev, what's your final rating?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be quite generous this go around and just say a 10 out of 10 because I did have some nitpicks, but they weren't enough to really knock it down too much. And since I do think this is the best from the time period, and they kind of, to put it more crudely, kind of blew their load a little bit early, this is a 10 out of 10 for me.
Well, there you go. So thank you for watching episode 4 of Super Kaiju Binge, and look forward to the next episode where me and Shawnee Boy, who will be making his debut, will be tackling what else came out in 1954 that's not Creature from the Black Lagoon? The original Godzilla. Look forward to that episode. Post your comments down below. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button and share this video with your friends. Trev, you got anything to plug?
Everybody who has subscribed or hasn't subscribed yet to my channel, Trevor Thomson or Trevor Fictosphere, I'm going to have my second video coming along this coming week, and actually, hopefully, I'll probably crank out at least 2 more after that. So, there you go.
Alrighty. So go subscribe to Trev and go join Jackson Knight Productions Official, which is my official group for my YouTube channel. Well, no, I'm not going to say that. So go join that. You can post videos or topics that you have of your own from your own YouTube channel, or just join it to become a member of the Jacksonite Productions family, as I'll call it. And as always, go out, and if you come across a giant colony of ants, run. And I will see you guys in the next video. If it'll end. There it goes.